In the initial phase of gait, known as initial contact, the foot contacts the ground with 20 degrees of hip flexion, 0 to 5 degrees of knee flexion, and an ankle that is neutral. In the loading response phase, body weight is transferred to the reference limb and shock is absorbed on a flexed limb. 20 degrees of hip flexion, 15 degrees of knee flexion, and 5 degrees of plantar flexion. At the mid-stance phase, the body moves over a stationary foot and balance on one foot is maintained. 0 degrees of hip flexion, 0 to 5 degrees of knee flexion, and 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. In the terminal stance phase, the body progresses past the stationary foot and balance is maintained. 20 degrees of hip extension, 0 to 5 degrees of knee flexion, and 10 degrees of dorsiflexion. In the pre-swing phase, there's generation of momentum for forward propulsion for swing limb advancement, with 10 degrees of extension, 40 degrees of knee flexion, and 15 degrees of plantar flexion. In the initial swing phase, there's clearance of the swing limb with 15 degrees of hip flexion, 60 degrees of knee flexion, and 5 degrees of plantar flexion. At the mid-swing phase, there is deceleration of the limb, 25 degrees of hip flexion, 25 degrees of knee flexion, and the ankle in neutral. At terminal swing, with the limb is extended for step length and preparation for loading. 20 degrees of hip flexion, 0 to 5 degrees of knee flexion, and the ankle in neutral. Great sentence structure.